The fact that we have seen organised crime move much more into this space, it's not sort of just your individual doing something bad. This is big business. We still haven't fully adapted to the risks that exist in the online world in general. It's not really a question of, liking crypto, not liking crypto. It's really a question of kind of be very practically minded and put in place some of those safeguards so that we have more transparent markets, we have more consumer protection, and some of those very foundational things like sanctions or money laundering, terrorist financing, those are actually protected against by having those rules. The tooling is there to be able to tell your customers in specific instances when they're about to make a transaction which goes to a wallet which has been identified as involved in illicit activity.
This is What the Fraud, a podcast by Sumsub, where digital fraudsters meet their match. I'm Thomas Taraniuk, Head of Partnerships here at Sumsub, the global verification platform helping to verify users, businesses, and transactions. The Securities and Exchange Commission, otherwise known as the SEC, sued cryptocurrency exchange Kraken in 2023, alleging it had violated investor protection laws. The SEC claims Kraken acted as a broker, dealer, exchange, and clearing agency without registering with the regulator. This is an extreme example of fraud in crypto, but is also a good indication of how seemingly legitimate businesses that engage in large amounts of business on a day-to-day basis can be secretly committing wide-scale fraud. In this episode, we'll be exploring the issue of fraud in crypto and its involvement in money laundering schemes, money muling, and investment scams. We'll look at the complex issues for those trying to find and prevent criminal activity in the sector and how AI and deepfakes are making things even trickier for investigators. Today's guest is Caroline Malcolm. Caroline is the Vice President of Global Public Policy at Chainalysis and has had a lengthy career working in global tax and finance institutions. In 2018, Caroline was the founding head of the OECD's Global Blockchain Policy Center. She led a team assessing the policy implications of distributed ledger technology, including topics as diverse as fintech, cybersecurity, data privacy, supply chain due diligence, digital skills, and antitrust policy. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us on What the Fraud.
Thomas, really great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So let's start with the broad strokes. Just last year, the US Department of Justice discovered $3.6 billion worth of crypto, which had been stolen back in 2016. These are huge figures we're dealing with, and they're only going to get bigger. Caroline, in broad terms, how has the landscape of fraud in the cryptocurrency industry evolved over the past year?
It's a good question, Tom, because we've actually seen the landscape of illicit activity generally, but also that specific area of fraud change quite a lot, not just in the last year, but really since Chainalysis has been tracking the ecosystem, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. So
congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a while. There's a couple of different sort of trends I would highlight. Certainly, when it comes to this area of fraud, or what people, might more commonly known as scams, is that we actually see, as the market goes up and down, which of course it does quite a lot when it comes to the world of crypto, we see the types of scams change. So certainly in a rising bull market like we have now, the level of investment scams, for example, often starts to increase. What does tend to remain pretty constant and has actually increased significantly since really starting in 2020, but even just in the last 12 months alone, is the area of romance scams. So something which we might be very familiar with from the world of traditional finance. I think, almost everyone's got an email from a Nigerian prince sitting in their email inbox somewhere.
Not myself so far, but looking forward to it.
I can send them your way. But look, that world has very much come to the world of crypto, and we sort of think of it as kind of financial grooming. It's that idea that over time, it's not just that one-off, that you tend to see perhaps in an investment scam, but it's over time cultivating victims so that they send you more and more funds.
Well, that's really interesting to hear. And given the, let's say, increase in sophistication of fraud techniques, What do you believe are the most prevalent types of fraud currently affecting the crypto industry? And besides romance scams, let's say.
Yeah, so romance scam is definitely the big one. And when we look at we tend to look at, say, average payment size. And there's no question romance scams sitting at about an average payment size of about $4,500 per payment. Now, that's not per victim, because obviously most victims are going to be making multiple payments. But per payment, that's certainly the highest. The other one, which I think probably has a more technical aspect, and we've also seen growing, is what we call approval phishing scams. This is essentially where, perhaps unwittingly, or certainly unwittingly as to the consequences, people are giving approval to fraudsters to actually access their wallets. Now, that, of course, can be quite common in the world of some particular applications, particularly in the DeFi space. But when that application is actually been, fraudulently developed, you're giving access to your wallet funds and the ability to make transactions on your own behalf by someone who's really just there to steal your funds, not to put it to a legitimate purpose.
And it does show that the importance of sort of tracking these funds and stopping them when they are going to be converted, let's say, from crypto to fiat at an end source is super important. From another angle as well, there's a lot of coined terms around rug pulls, etc., where media stars and celebrities are actually taking advantage of their audience. Is that something that we're going to continue to see in the coming years?
Look, we certainly see sort of the growth of sort of what we'll call the rug pull industry. And I think perhaps that word and the fact that we have seen organised crime move much more into this space. It's not sort of, just your individual doing something bad. This is big business. So if we think about illicit activity generally, we're looking at about $24 billion in 2023. Wow. But the scam space alone is about a fifth of that, just over $4.5 billion that we've tracked so far. And we keep those numbers updated because, remember, we're receiving information all the time about, well, this is a scam address or that's a scam address. And as we do that, and that's often historical data, so as we do that, you'll see those numbers increase over the next year. So if we look back in a year, you'll go back to our 2023 numbers and see for scams, like for other illicit activity, that is actually higher than we're reporting today.
I would love to touch on sort of the regionality of this as well. So given recent news stories about the fraud in crypto that we're seeing and that we're talking about now, it could be easy to assume that much of it is primarily based out of America or is an American issue. Could you talk to us about maybe the regional differences in crypto fraud?
I think we certainly see different types of scams all over the world. One of the things, and coming back to this issue about kind of the rise of organised crime in the scam space, is that we're actually seeing and kind of coming to that fraud issue. We actually did a bit of a deep dive looking at what we sort of see as these financial grooming sort of compounds that get developed. And we spotlighted one in Southeast Asia, which is really, it's about that not only are these large groups of people actually running these operations to undertake fairly elaborate scams. And again, over time, it's that financial grooming aspect, but also the people who are actually, making those calls or sending those emails or sending those text messages, however they're reaching out to you. Often those people themselves are people who are victims of crime. They're often being trafficked and themselves are, being kept in these compounds with their families themselves also being asked to pay ransoms to get them out of those compounds. So it's a very complex network. And I think one of the things we've seen through the use of crypto, we've certainly seen it used in illicit activity, but it also gives a big advantage to law enforcement. And they're able actually to trace these different activities and identify, where you see those payments being made. That in fact, for example, two scams which might look unrelated do actually, come back to the same source and the same organised crime group. And I think that's a big difference that we've been able to make in terms of being able to make sure that these networks are properly identified. And you mentioned the US, and I think obviously, you mentioned a particular case there last year, and there's sort of very large sums of money involved in a particular hack in that case. And the reality is that, a lot depends on sort of the willingness and skill set of local law enforcement to actually drive forward progress in tracking these issues. And then there's obviously things that, victims themselves can do, as well as the platforms who might be intermediating some of these transactions.
Let's dive into the specifics then, Caroline. At Sumsub, we understand that money muling is a particular problem in the crypto exchange industry. Can you elaborate on the mechanics of the crypto money muling scheme?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting space because it touches that intersection of what we think of as off-chain and on-chain. So obviously at Chainalysis, we focus very much on the on-chain. And when we talk about the data we have about, say, the volume of scams, we're very much focused on that on-chain activity. But the reality is also crime or, money mule activities which have an off-chain element. So it might be that funds are being received by a person who's acting as an agent in the money mule case, who are receiving those funds potentially in a fiat currency, or they may be receiving them directly in crypto. And then they might, if they're receiving them in fiat, they might bring them into the crypto ecosystem, but they're not really doing that on their own account. They're doing it on the account of somebody else. And again, we've seen that kind of money mule activity in the traditional space like we see it in crypto. And the challenge, I think, for law enforcement there is making that transition from the off-chain world to on-chain world. But it's certainly, the use of crypto for money laundering as well as these other specific types of illicit activity is, again, something we've seen increase over time.
Often, money mules are individuals who are willing to sell their credentials to criminals, so they become part of a criminal network. But there are also victims who don't fully understand what they're signing up for and can be taken advantage of. How do we educate users of crypto platforms to help them better understand how to not become victims of fraud networks?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things that can be done. The sort of, the traditional education, I think, which is not specific to crypto, about, making people really verify and think about, just essentially sort of just stop and think, giving them awareness about the different types of scams that are out there. And so if they receive, for example, a particular type of email or a particular text message or, particular wording that it's used, it should start to set off a few kind of warning bells. The other thing we can do, kind of leveraging the transparency of blockchains, is that we're able to identify, particular wallets associated with illicit activity. And platforms work hard to flag to their customers, whether it be pop-up messages, be calls to clients, video calls to sort of say, are you sure you want to make this transaction? And the struggle there is that particularly in those financial grooming situations, this is like the heart of the manipulation, is that people have been told, the platform's going to ask you if you want to go ahead with the transaction. They'll tell you it's a fraud, but it's not. You need to trust me. They've built up that trust over time. And so it can be a very tricky space that I think doesn't have a single answer, but certainly sort of education about, the types of wording, the types of approaches that you can receive, those messages that the platforms can trigger to verify that you do in fact want to make this transaction, to try and get you to think twice or three times about what you're doing. And then, of course, once the transaction's been made, there are some various tools, whether it's sort of tracing, whether that tracing happens into, a personal wallet or to another service, or particularly depending on what type of assets happening. So we know, for example, stablecoins have been an area where law enforcement have been effectively been able to kind of ask for the freezing of those coins because they have that kind of technical capability, so that even if somebody has received those funds illicitly, they're not able to do anything with them because they can't move them anywhere from that wallet.
Definitely. And given that, we are in a bull run now, as they would coin it, right? There's going to be a lot of green faces entering the market and don't necessarily have all the information they need as a new investor or someone who's interested in the DeFi space. Do you think if we took a snapshot of the crypto industry now, including exchanges, that they are doing enough, these businesses, to educate all of these newcomers basically into this sphere?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And look, I think even the awareness on the services, the exchanges side of things has increased over time. And so it's almost, part of their education that as you get more involved in this space and your obligations towards your consumers, come alongside that. That's kind of the kind of license to operate, in a sense, whether that be a social license or an actual license. And people really start to sort of see, okay, There's much more awareness today than there is of those kind of social or legal obligations. And I think regulators also have gotten a lot more active in that space. So even things like, we see in some countries like Singapore, for example, customer suitability requirements. You really have to screen what type of customers that you allow on your platforms. They have to have a certain level of awareness about what they're actually getting involved in. Do they understand, some basic details about how the, digital asset ecosystem works? Or, in other jurisdictions, they're looking at levels of wealth to sort of say, look, we consider this a particularly high-risk area, and you can see that in their financial promotion rules, for example. And so if you want to get into this space, both the services have a higher threshold to reach, but also consumers might have to be a particular type of consumer, qualified investor, for example.
We've now touched on perhaps the money muling signs, but there is a whole other sort of element of fraud here around account takeover. So,
yes.
Account takeovers is a real problem. It's a problem that obviously lots of businesses are trying to solve outside of the crypto space. But take the CEO of Ripple, whose account was actually stolen, and this was a big news article. How can individuals as well as the businesses actually protect themselves from these account takeovers?
Yeah, so those account takeovers can happen in a variety of different ways. Sort of whether it be sort of social media based phishing attempts, or more direct avenues, technical avenues to actually, infiltrate somebody's account. And there, as I said, there's probably not one solution, but like a significant amount of vigilance on the individual side in terms of, how they keep their private keys, for example. Very, very basic things. We continue to see some sort of fairly kind of low technical level attacks on the ecosystem, where, even through things like, having, two-factor authentication, for example, like what many people, certainly in the cybersecurity area, would consider be table stakes. We still haven't fully adapted to the risks that exist in the online world in general. And that's true in crypto with account takeovers as it is in other parts of sort of the digital realm.
100%. And there's always more at stake when money's involved, of course, as well. But there's also been a concerning rise and you mentioned romance scams earlier, but in financial grooming, where innocent victims are actually befriended by the so-called fraudster and are then, let's say, conned into investing into a crypto scheme. So I maybe touched on this maybe with the overall influencer market, where they're creating these rug pulls, they're creating interest and generating this false marketing to drive customers towards investing and pumping up a market price, but then withdrawing everything. So once the innocent party decides to withdraw their investments, they're usually left out in the cold in these instances, with some losing their life savings or a lot of money. So from the criminals getting more sophisticated at these investment scams, let's say, what do you think the individual can do to actually spot them?
Again, there's a lot of information which is available online, sort of encouraging people to always seek another sort of verification point, just another test point, and I'm not talking about staying within the same Discord channel and asking others what they think of this, but really kind of going outside that environment. There are a lot of websites which will identify, this has been identified as a scam address, for example, and really actually kind of go and verify if it's something new, if it's something you haven't heard about. It's the classic, if it sounds too good to be true.
Probably is.
It probably is.
So with everything that we've spoken about so far, Caroline, it seems there's a real issue with identity verification. So from your perspective, what kinds of security processes do crypto exchanges currently have in place to stop fraudulent activity from happening?
Yeah, so look at the state of the obligations that exchanges are under. The world of identity verification, which is part of that broader world of sort of anti-money laundering rules, has definitely progressed. And that really began, even earlier, sort of going back to 2013 in the US when the first rules were sort of developed. We have the international standard developed in 2019. And so there's a couple of things that exchanges are required to do in most countries of the world today. Certainly identity verification when it comes to their customers, and sort of enhanced customer due diligence where that's required. And that might include things relating to source of funds. So where is this money that they're looking to invest actually coming from? Is it coming from illicit or licit sources? And can it be justified? But then also counterparty due diligence. So if I'm the exchange and I'm sending on behalf of a customer money to another exchange, I have to verify that that exchange is in fact who they say they are, but also that they have the proper controls in place. Or it might be that in the case that I have an account at an exchange and I want to send those funds to either my own personal wallet or somebody else's personal wallet. If we look at the European rules, for example, under the transfer of funds requirements, then actually verifying that that person, either if it's my own wallet, that I have control of it, so control verification. And if it's not my own wallet, that I'm at least collecting some basic details about, name, first name, last name, kind of address, something to be able to identify those people that, are touching a, intermediated service in some way.
The travel rule implemented in 1st of September 2023. It requires UK-based crypto asset businesses to collect, verify and share specific transaction information relating to the transfers of crypto assets at VASPs or virtual asset service providers as well. So how are regulatory requirements such as the travel rule shaping the efforts of crypto companies to combat fraud within this industry?
Yeah, so look, they're pretty fundamental. I think the Financial Action Task Force has highlighted in a report they brought out about a month ago and sort of said, we brought this standard out on things like the travel rule in end of 2018 for sort of 5-6 years down the track. And they sort of said, we haven't made as much progress as we'd like. And that's certainly true. And that's been slow in terms of individual countries. So the UK, you gave that example. We have a standard pushed out in 2018. Now it's just coming into force in the UK in 2023. So it's never as quick as anybody would like. And I think people see this as frustration or, perhaps that the crypto ecosystem is moving slowly. I do like to bring people back to kind of, ground them, I guess, in other similar scenarios. And certainly when the similar rules got brought in the traditional financial institution, it was about 10 years for implementation to actually take place. So not to excuse the sort of slowness, but there are, regulatory requirements. There's a lack of a common, what we call a sunrise date, a lack of a common start date between countries. So I might have an exchange here in the UK that's required to meet the travel rule. But if I'm transacting with an exchange in another country which hasn't yet implemented the travel rule, that exchange may not have all those details that I'm required to receive from them. And so just some of those very practical, very boring things that can actually, slow down that process. Look, I think we're getting there and we're on the right path and the technology is developing as well. And I guess we have seen a lot of progress is the reality.
Definitely. It sounds like it has taken a long time to come to fruition, right? But now that it is here and that we're hopefully going to be benefiting from it, how do you think the travel rule has impacted, let's say, the level of trust and transparency within the industry, particularly around the issues of money laundering or terrorism financing?
Look, I think it's given a lot of comfort to people who may not be, they may not have been the early adopters of crypto. They may not be kind of your Bitcoin maximalists, for example. But over the years, they've sort of taken an interest in the space for various reasons. But they might have been hesitant to get involved. But seeing that there are some of those safeguards in place, I think give people a degree of comfort. The reality is most people don't want to find out that, say, North Korea is on the other side of a transaction that they're making. Right. And so it kind of gives that level of comfort that there is these sort of regulatory safeguards in place. And I often say to policymakers, decision makers who are considering making these rules that, people often say, well, if we pass these rules, then we're sort of agreeing with crypto. And it's not really a question of, liking crypto, not liking crypto. It's really a question of whether people are already in this space.
It's not going to go away.
It's clearly not going away. And, given that fact, you're better off to kind of be very practically minded and put in place some of those safeguards so that we have more transparent markets, we have more consumer protection, and some of those very foundational things like sanctions or money laundering, terrorist financing, those are actually protected against by having those rules.
What changes and challenges will Web3 bring in terms of compliance in crypto?
Yes, it's a really interesting space because when we think a lot about kind of crypto, people think of them as, say, either financial or quasi-financial assets. Now, you get into the world of Web3, and it's a very blurry world, I think, where we have assets which aren't necessarily sort of financial in nature, but they have the fungibility, they have the portability, and they have some sort of value in a marketplace that we come to think of as financial assets. But they might be, they might be particular attributes in a game, for example. And so I think one of the questions which is still, yet to be answered is we've applied particular types of regulation to the financial space, and we've applied different types of regulation, or if we think about the internet, very little regulation to other parts of the space. If you have a spectrum which on one end is the financial asset and on the other end is your data asset, and in the between you have all sorts of different things. They might be, music files which get tokenized, for example. It might be tokens that you use in games, for example. NFTs, exactly. So if you think about these things, where do they sit? Are they more like a financial asset or more like a data asset? Because historically, we've treated financial assets and data assets very, very differently. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see, and I think we're not quite yet, that part of the ecosystem sort of hasn't reached maturity, although in some parts of the world, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, huge levels of adoption. And we really see like big growth in the Web3 space there. But sort of as that happens and these new business models can arrive where, it's not even about sort of paying 1 penny for something, it's like 0.0001 micropayment space.
Absolutely.
As that opens up, I think it's going to be some very interesting question. Do I apply the same know your customer rules to a video game where I might be trading in these things? Because we haven't done that historically. If we think about sort of multiplayer online games, we haven't done that level of KYC before for those.
So Caroline, what are your top 3 tips for crypto companies to protect their assets and their customers from fraudsters?
Yeah, good question, Tom. Look, number one is user education. And certainly, some of that sits on the user themselves, but also there's a huge opportunity that these platforms have to kind of run in education campaigns generally about the types of frauds. Secondly is the alerting. So, the tooling is there to be able to tell your customers in specific instances when they're about to make a transaction, which goes to a wallet which has been identified as kind of involved in illicit activity.
Right.
And the third thing is the kind of the follow-up. And you kind of alluded to this a little bit before in terms of, not just in the moment, but continuous sort of verification. Because again, this is one of the advantages. So maybe this is a customer who, when they made the first transfer out of your ecosystem, didn't transfer it to illicit activity. But we can now see that if you run those transactions again a couple of months later, for example, that maybe, that money ultimately made it into a darknet marketplace, for example. And that should raise some flags. How did we get there? What actually occurred in that chain? And I think, using those tools available, sort of the compliance approach, not just to alert, but also then to actually do those deeper dives, is kind of fundamental. So it's user education, using the technology to deliver like real-time alerts. And thirdly is the sort of compliance follow-up, the investigation side.
I think it's a fantastic sum up. Thank you for joining us on What the Frauds. It's been great having you.
Tom, really appreciate it. The work you're doing here is really important to bring awareness to everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining us once again for another episode of What the Fraud. The next edition of What the Fraud will be the final episode of the series, and we'll be looking into the psychology of a fraudster and how ego, the economy, and addiction can all play a part in turning someone to a life of financial crime. We'll explore the differences between a swindler and an impersonator and how understanding a fraudster's thought processes can better help us protect ourselves against fraud. What an episode this has been. I've learnt so much, and I think it will be incredibly valuable for companies and customers when protecting themselves against fraudsters and criminals. And as always, please like, comment, follow, and subscribe wherever you're listening to us now. Any feedback you can give us is incredibly helpful and also makes it easier for other people to find us. And if you want to hear more about what we do at Sumsub and how your business can benefit from our verification services, definitely check out our website at sumsub.com and subscribe to our socials. What the Fraud is a Listen production. The producer is Aidan Judd. The executive producer for Listen is Kelly Redmond. And the executive producer for Sumsub is Mila Varavina. Stay safe and see you on the next one.